Hello, everyone. It's Elizabeth. Welcome to episode 1 of season 4 of the Conscious Kitchen podcast. Woo! It's summer of 2021, and the world is starting to look a bit different. More people are out on the streets, festivals are planned, friends are getting together, and hey, you might have even kissed your first new guy post lockdown. Today, we have brought to you an episode based on science. There are way too many opinions and myths floating around about how the new COVID strain is, vaccinations, infertility, etc. So, we brought you two scientists to educate us all on the things we truly don't understand. I don't have a science degree, and if you don't either, let's make sure we're listening to facts from people who know. I'd like to welcome Dr. Steyer and Dr. Love, the two hosts of the Unbiased Science Podcast, which is devoted to objective, critical appraisal of evidence on health topics relevant to listeners' daily lives. I'm a big fan of these ladies, and it's an honor to have them here with us today. Dr. Steyer and Dr. Love met over 15 years ago during their undergraduate studies at Stony Brook University. Dr. Steyer is a public health scientist with expertise in public health, policy, biostatistics, and advanced analytics. Dr. Love is an immunologist and microbiologist with expertise in infectious disease, immunology, cancer immunology, and autoimmunity. They believe strongly in scientific education, health literacy, and the translation of research for the general public. So let's all learn some things today from these two lovely ladies. Welcome.
Woo! Welcome,
Thank
ladies.
you guys so much for having us.
Thanks for having us. We're super excited to be here with you all.
Got some educated, smart ladies in the house. Okay, guys, this is going to be a great episode.
Yes.
Can't wait.
Yes. And so I just want to dive right in. I want to know, what made you guys decide to pursue science as a career? Was it something when you were little, it sparked your interest, or what really was it that drove you in that area?
Andrea?
So I'm a super nerd. I was always fascinated with all things science and nature and creepy crawly ever since I was a little kid. I used to collect bugs in the woods with my late brother when we were kids, and we would catalog them and identify them. We had this little taxonomics, sequence that we would do when we collect beetles and stuff. And as I got older, it evolved into more focused in terms of not just the critters, but the actual diseases that critters could in fact transmit. And so I think even from when I was about 4 or 5 years old, people knew that I was going to be something involved in science. And when I was about 10, my mom was working on her teacher certification at Eastern Connecticut State University. So I grew up in Eastern Connecticut, and I took out the medical textbook from the Eastern Library, the Physician's Guide to Arthropods of Medical Importance. So these are arthropods, so ticks and mosquitoes and things like that transmit diseases, basically. And so it's a hundreds of page textbook, and I would walk around 10 years old reading passages to people that would sit there and listen to me kind of gross them out. And I liked the shock value a little bit. I used to do little school research projects on things like leeches, and I would bring live leeches in as like a visual aid, and do things like cat parasites and the life cycle of a tapeworm and all these sorts of things, because I really like to gross people out. And then as I got a little bit older and a little bit more mature, high school, I took microbiology, and I just was obsessed with it. And, that kind of evolved through college. I worked in several different research labs throughout college. And I think, we kind of knew where I was going, and I really honed in specifically on what I was going to study. But even in high school, I wrote my college application essay about how I was going to get a PhD in microbiology and study infectious diseases. So pretty much followed that path. And I never really kind of felt too inspired about anything else. I mean, I think all science is super interesting, but this is really my wheelhouse.
Wow. And yeah, it seems like you were just born into it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
She's a super smarty pants. My journey was very, very different than Andrea's. I wasn't sure what I was going to do to be as a little girl. Sorry. Do you see this big fly? Do you see what I'm doing here? Do you see this?
Oh my God.
A horse fly, Andrea. You would probably love it. So anyway, I thought I was going to be a veterinarian when I was a kid. I was always drawn to helping animals, people, something healthcare. I wasn't quite sure what. I took all those courses that Andrea is describing, biology. I hated those classes. Those were not for me. I was always drawn so much more to the statistics and the math side of things, but also science and healthcare. And so I won't bore you with the details, but I considered medical school, I considered law school to get into health law, I did some bench research, and finally I landed on public health, which is, people don't really know what it is, but it's based, for me, it's the analysis of health data, looking at different outcomes, health quality, utilization of care, and basically trying to improve population health.
Wow.
So I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, that makes
She's
sense.
also a smarty pants, so don't let her diminish that.
Oh man, you guys all have very important roles in our societies. So thank you for your work.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's so interesting just to hear like how you guys came to, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Andrea and I, as you mentioned, we met in undergrad at Stony Brook, and we both we graduated, and to be honest, we didn't really keep in touch, from a distance, cheering each other on as we advanced in our respective careers as scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And we reconnected via social media over our shared frustration with anti-vaxxers. Mm-hmm. And the pandemic really lit a fire under us to formalize this in some way. And that's how Unbiased Science was born.
Wow. So Unbiased Science was really born from the need, from this pandemic opportunity really arising. Do you think that was...
I think, we probably started talking about the need to be a credible outlet when Jess had kids. So, 4 or 5 years ago. And, so I've been kind of immersed in the thick of it, right? So I actually studied Lyme disease for my PhD, my graduate research. And that is also an infection that is rife with misinformation. And we're actually, our current podcast sequence is focused on dispelling a lot of those myths. Mm-hmm. And so I've been inundated with a lot of the misinformation that circulates about infectious diseases in general and vaccines and all sorts of stuff. But then when Jess started interacting with these mom groups, not as a scientist, but as a mom, she was just baffled by the amount of, myths that circulated amongst them and the amount of kind of fear-based pseudoscience that was circulating. And she would try and speak out as a credible source, and they would, lash out and be hostile and be not receptive to that. And
kick me out of mom groups.
Yeah. So we actually,
that girl in the mom groups.
We actually started talking about it, maybe we should do this. Maybe we should start a podcast. But, there was never really a good time, right? Like, she had just had kids, and, I was going through some stuff in my personal life, and there was just never an opportune time. And then once the pandemic hit, and if you're in science, you know that this is not the first pandemic, but for kind of pop culture, it is. And we were like, we really need to address it now. And that was kind of, the impetus of all this stuff we had talked about casually for so many years, finally putting it into action.
Wow.
So powerful. Yeah. I mean, we need these resources. And you guys are amazing educated women. So it's like, I don't know. I feel like I could trust you more, Yeah.
I mean, we got to trust science. If we don't trust science, if we don't trust the facts, I mean, what the heck are we doing? And you're so right. There are so many people that push their opinions as facts. And when you do digging, you're like, where did this really come from? And you're like, you realize that it wasn't even a fact that they're touting this idea from. And it's really nuts.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And, social media is a bit of a double-edged sword in that regard, right? It's great for connecting people and being able to share information far and wide, but it also leads to the sharing of misinformation. And we know that misinformation spreads faster than credible information. And that, of course, has gotten accelerated, in the science sector, but of course, even regarding other social issues, right? We know that it's not exclusive to science misinformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. So tell us, why is it, like, what do you find the biggest things that people are so afraid of vaccines? Like, what is it? What's like the main thing that they're just like, that you really always have to dispel because they're just like this fear mongering, basically?
So historically, the biggest things are the false link to autism. And this is, I guess, a lesson in the peer review process. So, we talked about Andrew Wakefield and kind of the whole modern anti-vax movement on one of our podcast episodes, but he published a paper in The Lancet, which is a very reputable British journal, and he made a variety of false claims about the MMR vaccine and links to autism in children. And ultimately, when people did some digging, they found out that he cherry-picked information. He was using self-reported symptoms from parents of children, which is not actual data. He also had a financial stake. He was trying to sell his own vaccine, and he was trying to lead to distrust in the existing authorized vaccines. But what ended up happening is that even though that paper got completely retracted outright, he lost his license to practice medicine. He actually fled to the US. He lives in Texas now, where he's a vocal advocate of the anti-vaccine movement. But
I'm dating Elle McPherson. In case
right.
Yeah.
Oh, crazy.
But celebrities kind of grabbed onto it, and kind of people use it as a foothold, even though the science, we've debunked it thousands of times, right? There's been years and years of studies that have debunked it. And, people just can't seem to let go of that misconception. And a lot of it is, this need to have some sort of explanation for some phenomenon, right? And that's kind of the same things we see for all sorts of fears, right? People are afraid of the unknown or afraid of what they can't see, right? And even though we have all this data, there's a general distrust amongst people that are opposed to vaccinations. And so they'll make up things like it wasn't tested, or there's toxins, or there's things like that.
And I think this general mistrust of pharma, that's a big thing. Not understanding how rigorously studied and tested these things are. We all know all eyes are on vaccines, the controversy around vaccines, the trials, the way that they're designed. I mean, the best science. I mean, it's incredibly designed, randomized controlled trials. It doesn't get better than that. There is so much transparency, and people don't realize that. And then to your point, I mean, now I know we're speaking specifically about the COVID vaccines. You hear mRNA technology, and as you're saying, people fear the unknown. People don't know what that means, but immediately, it's going to alter my DNA. How? Tell me, what is DNA? They don't even know, but there's this fear of the unknown. Just as if you read the ingredients in a banana, sure, they sound really scary, the chemical names of, the components of a banana, but they're not all that scary as if you understood what they actually are.
So what is it exactly? What can really alter your DNA? What are some of the things that could?
So that's a good question. Things that alter your DNA are things that we're exposed to all the time. Sunlight, ultraviolet radiation, that alters your DNA. That is why repeated exposure without sunscreens progressively lead to cancer, because altering your DNA means a piece of DNA is damaged, which means that a mutation may occur, and cumulative mutations can progress to cancer. So things like, high level exposures of known carcinogens. So chemicals at specific doses, because we know the dose makes the poison. Cumulative effects. So things like tobacco smoke for years and years and years. Those things are things that alter your DNA. What doesn't alter your DNA is RNA. So even though they both have the NA part, they're two very distinctly different molecules. They don't exist in the same compartment of cells. Our cells make RNA all the time. Our cells, that's what a protein it comes from. It's a template for protein. So everything in our body came from an RNA at one point, but they're very small and short-lived molecules, and they're simply used by our cells to be a template for protein, and then they degrade, they deteriorate. They don't ever interact with our DNA.
Got it. That's so uniquely explained. And yet, so briefly on the IGTV, you guys were mentioning what's actually inside of the vaccine. Can you tell us about that? And people think there's a tiny bit of the actual virus inside of the vaccine. Can you explain that?
Do you want me to jump in here, Jess?
I'll with my layman's terms, I'll just say there is no virus in the vaccines. And now I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying, because I really truly thought there was a little bit of the virus in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the great thing with this technology that we're using is it's actually a quite simple vaccine formulation. So the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are using the RNA technology. And so basically what it is the virus itself is, and I wish I had my stuffed animal nearby, but I have a plush coronavirus somewhere floating around. My cat probably took it as a toy, but so it's got this, capsule of proteins and fats around the outside, and then it has those spike proteins that stick out from the virus capsule. And the reason it's called a coronavirus is because corona means crown. So these spikes look like a crown. And then inside the capsule, you have the RNA of the virus itself, because the virus also needs to make more of its own proteins when it infects a cell. But what we've basically done for these vaccines is we took just the sequence that makes the spike protein. So the template of RNA that tells any protein machinery that reads it to make the structure of that spike protein. And that's it. That's the only component. And that RNA is protected inside a bubble of fats. So cholesterol is one of the lipids that are in the vaccines, and a few others. But what they do is they make a little fatty protective bubble around the RNA, because the RNA is very fragile. If RNA was just loose, it would degrade and it wouldn't be useful. So the fat bubble kind of mimics what the outside of a virus is, but it's just fat. And it also helps deliver the RNA to our cells. So once we get it injected into our muscle, it's able to get into our actual cells. And then once it's inside our cells, our body looks like there's a machinery complex called the ribosome in our cells, and they see this RNA and they're like, oh, there's RNA, I'm going to make a protein. And so they make the protein, and then the protein is made, and then our immune system is like, hey, that's not a human protein. And so then it thinks that it's a foreign invader, and it mounts an immune response just like you would if you actually encountered the real virus. But it's just that little spike protein. And then aside from the RNA and the fats, there's some salt in the vaccine, and then there's some sugar. And all those do is they help balance the salt balance and the pH, so it matches our body. And then the sugar actually helps as a cryoprotectant, because some of the vaccines are stored in very cold temperatures. Mm-hmm. So it helps ensure it doesn't crystallize or aggregate, so that when you get the vaccine, it's all evenly resuspended. Right. And that's pretty much what it is. It's actually one of the most simple vaccine formulations of any vaccine we've ever really had.
And then are there any preservatives in this one as well, or are there not that many, and that's why it needs to be stored to such a particular degree?
Great question. So, the sugars and the salts act also somewhat as stabilizers and preservatives. But other than that, there's nothing else in the RNA vaccines. If we talk about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it has somewhat different preservatives. So it uses a very small quantity of ethanol in there, which is used as a stabilizer and a preservative. And it uses another very commonly used stabilizer called polysorbate 80, which is used in food products. It's used in cosmetic products. It's used very ubiquitously. And the reason for that is because that is, instead of an RNA vaccine, it's a vector vaccine. And so the main difference there is, instead of using a capsule of fat, it uses the shell of a harmless virus called adenovirus as the delivery vehicle. So it's basically very similar. Instead of the fats, it just uses this. It's like the exterior of an adenovirus, and they've removed the components of that can reproduce. And then it has the gene for the spike protein inside. So that one has somewhat different stabilizers / preservatives, but none of the ones that are used in other vaccines that are based on things like attenuated or intact viral vaccines.
And is there a vaccine that you tend to like most, or because I know all the other countries have different vaccines too? Like, are you looking at those as well and just understanding the different vaccines from like worldwide?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a lot of other vaccines being used. We have some other viral vector vaccines. For example, Gamaleya in Russia, the Sputnik 5 vaccine is a viral vector vaccine. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is a viral vector vaccine. We also have some that actually are using inactivated virus. So these are being used in China and other parts of Asia. Those are called the Sinopharm and the Sinovac vaccines. So what they do is they use the intact coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, but they kill it. They inactivate it using a chemical treatment. So physically it's intact and it looks like the virus, but it's completely inert. And that's the same principle that we use for our flu vaccines. It's called an inactivated viral vaccine.
I was just going to chime in and say that we've had people message us and say, please, we won't tell anyone which is your favorite of the 3 that are authorized in the US. And honestly, it just so happened that I got Moderna. Andrea got Pfizer. We would have gotten J&J if it was available to us. People compare them directly, and you can't do that because it's like comparing apples and oranges. The clinical trials were conducted at different times and in different populations. So J&J was tested later at a time when the variants were more prevalent. And so, yes, does it seem like the efficacy is lower? It might seem that way, but you can't do a direct comparison because, again, they were tested when the variants were more prevalent. So all 3 of the US approved vaccines are fantastic, very high efficacy. We often use the flu vaccine as a benchmark, which has an efficacy of between 30 to 60%. And so these vaccines are just incredible, exceeded expectations.
Boom. You heard it here first. So cool. Thank you guys. Wow. All the knowledge you guys have is just mind blowing. So thank you. Wow. Super cool. I wanted to talk about like effects. So, people are experiencing different side effects and things like that. Do you guys have any insight on why women are feeling more of the side effects from the vaccine?
Yeah. So, it's an interesting, so women generally have somewhat more reactive immune systems. It's also why we hypothesize that autoimmune disorders are more prevalent in women than men. It's almost 2 to 1. Some of that is linked to differential hormone signaling. Some of that is linked to, changes in the immune cell populations. But it's not at all surprising that we are seeing that women on the whole are experiencing more pronounced symptoms after vaccination. Now, it's not something to be concerned about. As we've talked about, those symptoms are what we call reactogenicity, which is basically your immune system has done its job. It recognized that spike protein doesn't belong here and it's mounting that immune response so that when you do encounter the real virus, you'll already have that memory ready to go. But also people were concerned that they didn't have symptoms. And if you look at the clinical trial data, about 50% of people didn't experience anything. So you don't need to be concerned either way. Some people just have more potent or more obvious immune responses. I know for me, after the first dose, I had a little bit of arm soreness and not much else. After the second dose, I had very pronounced lymphadenopathy, which is a swollen lymph node in my armpit. But other than that, I had almost nothing. Whereas Jess had like fatigue and fever and headache. And so it manifests differently in different people. And that really underscores the complexity of the immune system. And that's why it's very frustrating as an immunologist when people who are not immunologists try and explain the immune response or how the immune system works.
Yeah, I love your stories, how how Jessica and how Andrea, you guys have just been documenting how you felt after your vaccine. And I think that transparency is important just so people can understand, feel comfortable, and then make their own
Yes.
decision, right? Because ultimately it's up to you because, you know, you're a human. You can make that decision, but at least knowing what everyone else is going through and really understanding like the data as much as you can through people like Jessica and Andrea, it gives us like better opportunities to make informed decisions.
Yes, better informed decisions, and just knowledge is more power for you too to make better decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's important, you know, obviously the data is unequivocal, right? It's the vaccines are safe and effective, and you know, even people that experience those side effects, it's very short-lived, and it certainly pales in comparison to COVID-19, right, which we know is fatal. But you know, there are some of these symptoms that are less common, like the lymphadenopathy. And you know, after I shared it, I had a bunch of messages where people were like, "Man, I thought I was the only one. My armpit felt crazy," or you know, and so it does, telling those personal stories does help to alleviate, especially when it comes along with an explanation. Like, this is why your lymph node is swelling. And then people are like, oh, okay, so nothing to worry about, you know, glad I was keeping an eye on it.
And just one thing, if I could jump in, my public health heart is feeling compelled. You're absolutely right. It's a personal decision, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that this decision does have an impact on all of us as a society. And so if you're young and healthy and you think, oh, I'm going to be fine even if I get COVID, you have to think about how you can then transmit the virus to someone who, you know, maybe their immune system didn't mount a very potent response after getting vaccinated, or maybe they're immunocompromised or they have cancer. And so, yes, it's a personal choice, but you can't be driven by fear. You have to understand the science of it and how every single, you know, true expert in the field is saying this is a no-brainer. And it's the only thing that's going to get us out of this pandemic.
Yes,
so
yes, thank you.
I think Jess, you made a really good point, because, you know, there are a lot of younger adults who are not getting the vaccine because they don't consider themselves high risk. But these new variants, in particular B117, is actually demonstrated to have more severe illness in younger people. And the demographics of those that are being hospitalized now are younger people. Under 40s, they're having a big surge in hospitalizations. And part of that is because a lot of the older populations are now getting vaccinated, so they have that level of protection. So we're not seeing as many of those folks being hospitalized. But also, because this variant is more transmissible and it also is causing more severe illness, people that maybe wouldn't have been as high risk with the original virus are now developing more severe COVID.
Yes. Yeah. I think that these are all great things to remember, right? Thank you, Jessica, for adding that. I always I'd like to think that it's like, if you're not going to get the vaccine and like you're young, then you better just stay in your room and just be locked and be like in lockdown for however long. You know, it's like, at least take some responsibility. Fine, you don't want to get the vaccine, but then do something else to like protect other people, because it's not just about you, like you said. It's a personal choice, but it affects others, and so it's super important to just have that in your mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so we talked about the vaccine not changing like your DNA, right? And so there have been a lot of like talks about like pregnant women and the vaccine. Are some women concerned that the baby's DNA could be changed? Is that even possible? Or what is the concern with that?
So none of it is possible. There are people that obviously have concerns, but a lot of those concerns are, of course, unfounded. So there was a myth about how the vaccine was going to cause your body to attack a placental protein called syncytin-1. And they were saying that it was because the proteins were so similar in structure. And that is just patently false. You can actually look at the sequence, the sequence of a protein structure, and you can compare the spike protein to that placental protein. You can see that they are not similar in any way, shape, or form. And so that myth circulated early on, and we and others spent a lot of time debunking it. And so that was kind of the first part. So no, there's no link to fertility issues. There's no risk of getting vaccinated during pregnancy. And on top of that, we're now seeing that people who are getting vaccinated during pregnancy are transferring protective antibodies to the fetus across the placenta, or when they're nursing, to the nursing child through their breast milk.
And one concern that some people have had is, when in pregnancy, are there certain times when it's safer to get vaccinated than others? The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists says you can get vaccinated at any point in your pregnancy, in any trimester. Some clinicians have expressed a concern early in the first trimester. We know that if the mother develops fever, that could lead to potential miscarriage or birth defects. However, high fever is such a rare side effect, and pregnant women can safely take Tylenol in pregnancy. So if you were at all concerned, you can wait until second or third trimester, but the experts are saying you can safely get it at any point in your pregnancy. And as Andrea said, you're protecting yourself, you're protecting your baby. We're seeing the data. Babies are being born with the antibodies in the cord blood. It's incredible. It's the best thing that you can do for yourself and your baby. And the last thing I'll say is that if you were to develop COVID in pregnancy, the outcomes are very poor, much higher rate of intensive care and hospitalization among pregnant mothers, and for early emergency C-sections for mothers who develop COVID.
Yeah. So if you're trying to get pregnant, might as well just get the vaccine even before you're pregnant then, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's no risk to fertility. There's no risk to people who are trying to conceive. And, if you have antibodies before you get pregnant, those will also ultimately get passed across the placenta. And again, if you decide to breastfeed, we of course are of the mentality that fed is best, but if people are choosing to nurse, you also will have those protective antibodies, and that's, whether you're bottle or breastfeeding.
Yeah. And I guess everyone's always concerned on what are the long-term effects to my baby, right? And it's but I mean, I don't understand. I'm not sure what the concerns are, but there's nothing really that we should be concerned about in that sense either.
You're absolutely right. And the thing is effects from vaccines don't typically emerge years down the line. Any sort of effects from vaccines, they're going to be apparent within the first couple of months. And that's been true throughout the history of the development of vaccines. And RNA vaccines have been studied for decades. There are other RNA vaccines for other diseases that were in clinical trials decades ago, and they didn't go forward because they just weren't very effective for that particular illness. So we have data, that demonstrate that, RNA vaccines are not detrimental in the long term. And so we have more than 6 months of data at this point. Pfizer is going to be moving towards that BLA, application for full FDA approval because it requires at least 6 months of clinical trial data. So we have more long-term data, and we know that they are continuing to be safe and continuing to protect people. And on top of that, we know that the detrimental effects of COVID can be long-term and persistent. So that's, just another reason why you want to get that vaccine, even if you're considered low risk.
And just one thing to add, I think people think that this mRNA technology is new, but it's something that we've actually studied for more than 3 decades. So this is not a new technology. So just want to mention that.
Yeah, that's good to know, because I feel like people, they just get freaked out when something feels new. So to know that there's been 30 years basically of research on it will hopefully put some people's minds at ease. And so we have the new strain, right? It's popping up, and are we going to have COVID around forever? Is that just going to be the thing?
It's hard to say. In some capacity, probably. But the goal is, of course, to get people vaccinated to the point where we can control the ongoing pandemic. Because once we get to a point where it's not spreading rampantly, then you're only going to have kind of periodic, pop-ups of the virus every now and then. And it's possible it's going to exist. Once it emerges, viruses don't really disappear outright. But if they don't have a lot of hosts, hosts to infect, they don't have a lot of places to go. And that's really the goal of the vaccination. And
if I could just chime in. So what you're saying, Andrea, is so the virus may be around, but the pandemic is going to end.
Exactly. And that's true for all sorts of things we have vaccines for. And we see the consequences when we stop vaccinating. So these measles outbreaks we've seen because parents are, not vaccinating their children with the MMR and things like that. We see then emergence of measles outbreaks. And so, we have real world data of the consequences of implementing vaccines and then halting vaccines. So, the good thing with this is that the variant, particularly the one that's most dominant in the US now, the B.1.1.7, the vaccines protect against. So that's good news. So that means if you've gotten vaccinated now, it's going to protect you. And that's really encouraging. And right now we have at least 6 months of data that say that the vaccines are effective. And we expect that it's going to last quite a bit longer than that. Influenza is its own little unique creature that mutates extremely rapidly. And that's why we get an annual flu shot. But I wouldn't expect that to be the same for COVID-19.
Yeah.
Can I just underscore that?
Yeah.
Because there's some confusion. Some people think that we're saying that the vaccine is only effective for 6 months. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that it's effective for at least 6 months, right? We're constrained by the real world data that we have, but we all the experts expect that the vaccine will be effective for at least a year, if not longer. To be determined if we'll need boosters, but right now it's looking really good. We seem to continue to have a potent immune response for at least 6 months. Sorry.
So is it as long as after it goes to 7 months, after people have had it for 7 months, it's going to be 7 months, and as the months go, it's just going to kind of keep increasing because I see.
You got it. Exactly. So we can't make, as scientists, we can't make claims we don't have data for. So we tread very carefully. And that's something that is a nice way for people to try and vet what's misinformation and what's not, because scientists never make like all or nothing statements. They never make these, it's always going to do this, it's always going to do that, or it's going, all these cure quick or things like that. We're very methodical, and we don't, we tread very cautiously on making those kinds of statements. And so, we expect it to last much longer, especially if you look at the antibody levels 6 months out. They're very, very strong, and there's a T cell response that's very potent. So it's very encouraging to see. But, we have these variants, and the reason these variants emerge is because of random mutations. And the rate of mutations is dependent upon how much the virus is spreading. So the faster we vaccinate people, the less opportunities for the virus to spread, which means we're going to slow the mutation rate down. So if we can protect people faster, we're going to also reduce the likelihood of more variants emerging.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Data is sexy, y'all.
We agree.
We like to think so.
I'm like, can you guys be my new Dr. Fauci? Like, what the hell? Like, I'd rather be seeing two powerful, strong, very knowledgeable women on TV than Dr. Fauci. Sorry. Just want to add that in there.
We love Dr. Fauci, but, we have a little bit of our own flair,
I'm like,
I love
what the
that.
hell? You guys need to be doing a world tour. I'm just like, it's crazy.
Do you hear that? Yeah, someone tell us.
And so we're hoping, right, that this all kind of dies down. But if for the people that may still contract COVID, right, there aren't that many resources on like intimacy and when you can get, let's say, back in the bedroom with your partner or whoever you're with. Like when is it safe to like kiss your partner again, sleep with your partner again, all those types of things?
It's it's really interesting because you'll notice that if someone gets infected, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire household gets infected, right? It's not 100% infection rate, which is true for any virus. And so if one one person of a couple gets infected and they're doing the self-quarantine and isolation at home.
Mhm.
The current rule of thumb is typically for a milder case of COVID-19 that you're probably contagious for 10 to 14 days. And that's why that self-isolation period is about that time. If you have a more severe case or a situation where you have to become hospitalized, they extend that to about 21 days. So after that point, it's very unlikely that you would have enough virus even left over to transmit it to your partner. And so that's kind of the current rule of thumb in terms of becoming intimate again. And Jess, I'm sure you have something to add.
I was just going to say, just to be clear, COVID is not a sexually transmitted disease. So it's not the sex itself that's going to transmit the COVID.
Right.
But sex tends to be something that you do in close quarters with your partner. And so that's, of course, the person-to-person transmission.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I asked that question because I had a family member and like they're older and they were asking me like, well, I really want to sleep with my partner again. Like, when can I get back in there? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't find anything on the internet. I'm not sure. So
right. And it's, it's interesting because for some reason it's somewhat of a taboo subject, but ultimately you're going to base it based on those contagious guidelines. So, once you're safe to go into public, then you're safe to interact with your intimate partner.
Got it. Okay, cool. Well, I have another question. I have a few more questions, but I definitely want to ask a question about just Lyme disease. So kind of steer off a little bit from COVID. Another very crazy, right, disease that has a lot of misinformation and there's so much behind it too. Do you think that there will ever be a vaccine for Lyme disease? I know that there's even people that don't think Lyme disease even exists. Insurance providers won't even cover things for like Lyme disease sometimes, like neurological problems, even though you say you have Lyme disease. So there's just so much information. Do you think that will ever just stop happening?
So you're absolutely right. It's rife with controversy. Our next week episode is going to talk a lot about the myths and the misconceptions and really dig into what's real and what's not real. It's not that people don't believe that it exists, but it's often misdiagnosed or used as a scapegoat for other very non-specific ailments. And the reason that insurance providers won't cover certain treatments is because there's no data that suggests those particular treatments are effective. So there are standards of care to treat and kill this infection, which is actually caused by a bacteria. So we have a very effective treatment for it, antibiotics. Now, Lyme disease in and of itself, there actually was a vaccine developed in 1998 and licensed, and it was used for about 4 years. But unfortunately, the anti-vaccine movement was very prominent and vocal back then. And it was actually a very effective vaccine. It was about 78% effective at preventing infection. But due to a lot of the outspoken critics of vaccinations and the fact that it was not a mandatory vaccination, it was an optional vaccination for people that lived in high-risk areas. They actually eventually pulled it off the market just because people were not getting it. There are some early trials. Actually, Pfizer is one of the people that are starting a new clinical trial for a new Lyme disease vaccine. So it is very encouraging to see. I do hope it gets some attention because, it would be something that could alleviate a lot of people's stress about going out in the woods. And it's actually kind of difficult to get Lyme disease, but there's a lot of fear around it. And and I'm hoping that our podcast series on it will help to dispel a lot of that fear.
Awesome. Yeah. So everyone look out for that. That'll be on the Unbiased Science Podcast, streaming on Apple and all the different places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah. So that'll be a great episode for people to check out if they are interested in learning more about Lyme disease. Yes.
And people should know that Andrea did her doctoral dissertation on this topic. So she is the expert on this topic. So I just keep my mouth shut and listen to her talk when it comes to Lyme disease.
Is there a way? Because really the big carriers are the animals, right, of Lyme disease. So birds and like squirrels and like deer, right? They're the ones that really help to spread it.
So the bacteria is actually carried by two species of ticks. The black-legged tick on the East Coast, essentially Eastern US, and the Western black-legged tick on the California coastline. And so those ticks pick it up from the blood of infected animals. And of course, they can then infect another animal that's not infected and kind of complete that life cycle. And so the common source of food for ticks are things like rodents and deer and birds. The favorite meal of these two species of ticks, so it's not all ticks, it's just these two species. It's not other things like mosquitoes. There's no data to suggest any of that. But their favorite meal when they're in the nymph stage, which is one of the more infectious stages of tick, are the white-footed mice. And so we've seen increased prevalence of Lyme disease in areas that are clear-cutting forest or, land that abuts forest or places that we build houses, because we're encroaching on those wild lands where the mice live and where the ticks are getting their meals from. And so that plus climate change has expanded the geographic range of that.
Wow.
That makes sense. For sure. Yeah.
But the best offense is a defense. I always have to do my plug. So the best way to prevent it is to prevent tick bites. And it's, there's 3 steps, basically. There's repellents on your skin. There's pesticides that you can treat your clothing with. And then, of course, tick checks whenever you're in areas that there might be ticks around.
Yeah, I'm also from the East Coast. I remember seeing all those ticks everywhere and just being like, they're everywhere.
So, for example, Liz and I love to camp. So, the areas you were saying, so there's like more like deforestation areas, you were saying?
Yeah. So, places where you're going to encounter ticks are going to be, a lot of times the fringe between a grassy area and a wooded area. So ticks, they're not very mobile. So they actually hang off of blades of grass and they wave their arms around waiting for something to walk by that they grab onto. And that's really how they find something to eat, because they're not flying. They don't move that quickly. And so that's why rodents are great, because they're short and they're along the grass line and things like that. And they're not coming out of trees or stuff like that. So, if you're going to be in high grass or wooded areas or things like that, wearing high socks, wearing light clothing on your lower half, you're going to see anything crawling on you. The ticks also have to be attached for a minimum of 24 hours, but really 36 to 48 hours before there's even a chance that you can get infected. So even if you find one on you, you want to remove it with a tweezers. That's the only way to remove a tick. And that's going to reduce all your chances. And I will say, I grew up in the epicenter. The town adjacent to my hometown is Lyme, Connecticut, which is why it's named. And I've been bitten by tons of ticks in my life, and I've never contracted anything from any tick, especially not Lyme disease. So
that's good.
Wow.
Yeah,
so much information. Thank you so much.
I feel bad for the little ticks. So they're just chilling. They're saying hey, and then now they're just this big culprit. Everybody hates them.
I know. And I was describing it to Jess on our episode last week. So the thing they do, it's called questing, and they literally crawl up a blade of grass and they hang on with their back. So they have 8 legs when they're a nymph or an adult, and they literally wave their front legs side to side for something to walk by, and they're just hungry, right? Aww. They don't know any better, and but yes, they are a pest. And opossums eat tons of ticks. So they're awesome. You should love opossums. They eat thousands of ticks a day. They are nature's best defense aside from repellents.
Yes. So always be nice to the raccoons and the opossums, all the little critters of the world, because they're here for a reason, and getting rid of them throws off the entire balance of the world. So
for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to ask you, Jessica. So since you work in overall health and what do you guys are expecting for 2022? What do you want? What are you guys hoping for society?
What am I hoping for society? I would hope that the silver lining of this pandemic is that there's attention to preventive health and that we're not just focused on reacting to things.
Yeah.
If you look at what we're spending on healthcare and in the US in particular, it's sad. It's just a few percentage points of our GDP. So we really need to ramp up prevention efforts. I'm really hoping that we can combat the anti-vax movement. They were dangerous before, but they're downright deadly now in the middle of a pandemic. So just in general, I'm hoping that this, maybe we're all seeing vaccines in a new light. And again, just this renewed attention to preventative care.
And so how can we prevent? What are some of the things that we could do to prevent things like this happening in the future from your perspective?
Well, Andrea, what do you say about the zoonotic? You have something to say.
So I'll kind of I'll do it from like the science side, and then Jess will kind of do it from the population side. Yeah. So the vast majority of human infectious diseases. So preventative health is, of course, a broad brush. So preventative health is going to include, wellness visits and getting your vaccines and all of these things that are going to keep you healthy. Now, there are things that you can't avoid, like a viral infection. Even with vaccines, nothing is 100% effective. So we still want to be vigilant. And so what we know is that the vast majority of human infectious diseases, so these are diseases that you contract and it's a pathogen. So it could be a virus, it could be a bacteria, it could be a parasite. The vast majority of them, 61% of the ones that we know, are caused by illnesses that we call zoonotic. And what that means is it's a pathogen, which is a disease-causing microorganism that is originally from an animal and it crosses species into humans. And that includes things that we encounter all the time. E. coli, which is Escherichia coli, that's a zoonotic disease. Salmonella, that's a zoonotic disease. A lot of these things that we often don't even think of are zoonotic diseases. But what is happening is the rate of newly emerging diseases are shifting even more and more towards the zoonotic. So 75% of new illnesses that emerged in the last decade are zoonotic diseases. And that's compared to 61% of kind of the total. And the reason for that is because of humans' increased interaction with wild animals. So that could be when we travel for fun or for work and we want to go into a cave where bats live. We're interacting with bats, or we're poaching, not we, but people poaching animals. People having these live animal markets where you have species together in poor conditions that normally would not live together in the wild. So you have bats living near a pangolin or living near a civet, and they're in unhealthy conditions. They're sick. They have a virus. The virus is now interacting with other animals. There's opportunities for mutation. And that's really where SARS-CoV-2 emerged from, right? Other things like factory farming, where you have high density animals living in relatively unclean environments. They can pass from each other, but also pass to the farmers. So all of these things that facilitate the increased interaction of humans with non-human species accelerate the mutation and the emergence of these new pathogens, because ultimately these are all mutating randomly. It's not anything that's specific, but if a mutation occurs that enables it to now infect a new species, and to these pathogens, humans are just a new species, it's going to then infect us because we're susceptible, and they're like, hey, this is a new home for us. And that's really what drives that. So being more mindful of our impact on the world and how we interact with nature is really, really important.
So and also understanding, we're not going to be able to prevent everything, right? But what we need to do is ramp up our emergency preparedness. So where I think we really went wrong at the beginning of this pandemic is that we didn't have a united response to the pandemic. We needed very clear messaging that masks are a very cheap and highly effective way to prevent transmission. We need to put scientists who are able to communicate to the general public and translate in a way that's understandable for the layperson. We need to get those people up there and explain to the general public, what's going on and how can we combat this. In particular, I think we're really going to need to shift our efforts to working with certain subpopulations. We know persons of color in particular, for example, there's a lot of distrust of the scientific and medical establishments. And, we've talked about things like the Tuskegee syphilis study and the Nazi experiments during World War II. And we need to talk about those things, and we need to explain, we need to make clear we've come a very long way, that it's a very different world than it was decades ago. So I think it's going to be an emphasis on emergency preparedness, on transparency, and we need to get better at effectively communicating science to the lay person.
Yeah, lots of different things. Yeah, I love how you guys broke it down. Like you from like the public aspect, and then Dr. Love from just like from us humans, we just have to make more conscious decisions, right? From conscious traveling, that if you are going to go into some cave or something, that you're going to take the proper steps to not spread disease by like washing your shoes or doing all the cleanly things that you need to do. And do you think that if more people, here's just a question. If more people adopted diets where they didn't rely on like on animal products, would that also help then? Would that be a direct?
It could certainly, because, and it's not an all or nothing, right? We can do these things in a more sustainable and humane way and reduce our impact on the agriculture industry. But of course, like if we're saying, okay, we're not going to eat beef anymore, and then we're going to start eating more fish, and then you run the risk of overfishing, which is a whole other can of worms on an ecological impact. So it's got to be a balance, right? And part of that challenge is the world is technically overpopulated. We were overpopulated several billion people ago, and it's not the amount of people you can cram into square footage, it's the demand on the environment. And so we're seeing that, of course. And so, yeah, I mean, it's got to be these collective efforts. So, things to reduce collective carbon footprint, things to reduce collective impact on ecosystems. Humans are responsible for the extinction of so many species. We're seeing mass kill-offs of birds because of our behaviors. So it's not just infectious diseases, right? It's being more conscious of the fact that we don't live as a single species on this planet, and we have to kind of keep that in mind. And it's as tiny as the ticks, right? The ticks don't know that we're a human. They're just looking for a meal. And so it's being more mindful and conscious of how we interact with nature. And you're exactly right. Leaving no trace if we're traveling somewhere, or hiking or things like that, so that we can avoid, negatively or detrimentally affecting, our relationship with the ecosystem.
Boom. Love
yes. So much good information.
I feel like a revelation just listening to you guys talk. Like, wow, like just knowledge is power. And yeah, I mean, it's with everything going on with the planet shifting and the climate change, like that's definitely with all these new diseases coming about and viruses, like Jessica had such a good point too, is like to prevent. We need to like have all these preventative like systems in place, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so much.
And all the damn governments of the world, like just get your head out of your ass and just like work together on things. But I know it's so difficult. It's just the world we live in.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the big problems. Like, we're seeing now during this pandemic that the shift of people who are opposed to vaccination is actually a slightly different population than what might have been expected. It's now overwhelmingly white evangelical Christians. And part of that is how politicized science has become. And it really shouldn't be that way. And I really hope that I don't know the solution to it, but we have to kind of, get our hands dirty and really get into these, faith-based communities and find a way both factually and emotionally to kind of break through and, get people to understand that it's not ulterior motives. The people that are doing this work, it's not this evil pharmaceutical company. It's people, it's scientists. And a lot of this research is actually being done in academic and unaffiliated institutions. So it's not some, conspiracy out to get you. We're trying to protect people, and that's the goal of preventative healthcare. Is vaccines are preventative healthcare, well visits are preventative healthcare, affordable insurance for everybody so they can get to medical appointments is preventative healthcare. And I think we have to make sure that bubble extends to everybody.
Right. I love how you said that. That's so powerful.
quick is that, that's what we strive to do with Unbiased Science, is to remain unbiased, right? We don't just want to talk to people who already think the way that we do or understand some of these scientific concepts. We want to reach across the aisle and talk to people who are skeptical and keep politics completely at the door. Obviously, we're human. We have our own political leanings and ideas, but that's separate. We are data-driven, evidence-based. Everything that we say is rooted in evidence. And we even have show notes for all of our podcast episodes that have links to the studies that we're referencing. So we just want to make clear we're not coming into this with bias. We want to be totally transparent.
Yes.
Of it. You guys have to be the #1 science podcast out there. Come on, you guys, subscribe and follow them. Okay.
Aw, thank you.
Yeah, I want to leave the listeners with some inspiration. So if anyone has some newfound interest in science from this, right? It's so as women scientists, why is it important to support one another and to rally behind one another and make these big steps to educate the public on science?
So for me, the biggest thing is that, we know that sexual discrimination and misogyny exist in all job sectors, but in STEM and in science, women are still vastly underrepresented. And so the fact that, 2 young scientists that are women are stepping up to kind of fill this void in science communication is really meaningful to me on both a personal and professional level, because women are routinely bearing the emotional and societal burden of a lot of things. We often wear many hats in our personal and professional lives. And during this pandemic, we're seeing that the overwhelming proportion of scientists who are stepping up to be communicators are also women. I don't know exactly I'm sure there's a psychological explanation behind why that is, but, we felt this obligation to communicate science to the public. We can't just live in our bubble. We have to make sure that what we know is conveyed in a way that everybody can understand.
And I pinch myself that I get to do this with Andrea, who is, so brilliant. And I think it's awesome that we have these complementary perspectives. Andrea brings the micro and I bring the macro. And I think it's important because we're all in this together. It's not a competition. If anything, we cheer each other on, we lift each other up, and that's how we're able to do the best work, right? And I do think, Andrea, to your point, I think it's interesting that women have stepped up big time with SciComm, and I think it has something to do with our empathy, skills in communicating, our compassion. It's not just about boom, 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 presenting people facts. It's the way you communicate those facts. You need people to be receptive to you. And I think for whatever reason, women are very good at that. So,
yeah. I love that. Thank you guys so much for sharing. I mean, you could hear the passion in your voices. So thank you guys.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Oh, thank you. It's such an honor to talk to you guys. And anyone that wants to learn more about Andrea Love and Jessica Steyer, please visit their website on unbiasedpodcast.com. All their information is there. Subscribe to their podcast and also Instagram as well.
Yeah, and they also have really cute merch on there. So you guys better go support and buy a shirt.
Yes, and just one little correction. It's actually unbiasedscipod.com. Sorry.
Unbiased Sci. Oh, no, please. Thank you. Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you guys so much, ladies. Thank you so much. And we can't wait to see more of what happens to the podcast and let it grow. And just be the #1 science podcast out there, right?
Yeah.
We hope so. That's the goal, right?
Exactly. We're not going anywhere even after the pandemic. We've got lots to talk about.
Oh, I can't wait to
guys.
hear it.
Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Get ready because this is season 4. And if is this the first episode of season 4, we're coming in hot. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Have a blessed rest of your week and be sure to tune into our next episode.
Catch you guys later, Conscious Kitchen fam. Bye.
See ya.